And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I think we have several time zones here within our panel today, and welcome to episode 30. It's been a little while since we've hosted one of these. We just had a bit of a gap because of scheduling, but it's so great to be back and to have such a fantastic panel to keep talking about sport. Globally, nationally, locally, we have all sorts of great topics. And today we're going to be talking about a sport revolution. How do we evolve sport in Canada and shape a new sport paradigm in our country? I'll get to the introductions shortly, but as you know, I always start with a little bit of background about us, the webinar series, and the university as a whole, and some of our priorities. We always start by acknowledging and thanking the Lekwungen and Ksepsen people, also known here as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities, for allowing us to teach and learn, live, work, and play on unceded territories. You know, it's really important, even though we're not directly responsible for inflicting harms during our history, we are responsible for repairing, honoring the voices of those harmed, and working toward reconciliation, and really trying to live the values we uphold in our country of equity and respect and peace. And at Railroads, we definitely are a social purpose university and institution. We're learning centered. All of us are learners working toward social change that is positive for all. And all of our programs reflect that. We're all on our journeys. And I always think of myself as an instructor here as really just sort of holding someone's hand as they find their path. But this is a path I take to get down to my beloved meeting rooms and various on my office, etc. And I have a path very similar here at home at my home office. I take the dogs down. But I always want to kind of showcase the beauty. Taylor was saying we are one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, and I would have to agree. And I always like, especially when we have a Western or Prairie person on the online, just to say both of these. One is winter, one is summer. Try to figure out which is which. This is a wonderful place, the Japanese garden. We inherited these gardens as part of the Dunsmuir estate that was developed on these unceded territories. We love this bridge. It represents our school of communication and culture, where I am a professor and have been for a couple of decades now. The bridge to us really represents, it's a model for our school, but I think for the university as a whole, this idea of embracing diversity, of different sides, different perspectives. We don't always have to think of them as polarities, but just different. And when we're trying to build a bridge, whether it's a conversation, a discussion, a debate, or a handshake, we have to think about both sides and really embrace the fact that there are differences. You can't build a concrete bridge like this without understanding whether, you know, one side's eroding or in need of extra support or whatever. Fundamental premise. And similarly to learning from nature, like we do at Railroads, and to the 300 hectares upon which we are so lucky to be operating, I often think there's truth also in sport. I've spent my whole life involved with sport in some capacity. Love all sorts of sports, but really fell in love with this wonderful sport called rowing, going backwards fast in a skinny little, very tippy boat. And every day it teaches me something new. And as a researcher, I'm increasingly focused on sport as, I think, such a great opportunity for teaching the world how we can operate in a way that is more peaceful, more equitable, and really, you know, leverage what sport means. The word compete means to strive together. We sometimes forget that and think it means to destroy one another. But having lived through sport, I know how beautiful it really can be, and how that concept of collaborative competition can take hold of you and really impact you transformationally. Our model here is also very much about caring and community-based, applying what we're learning. So definitely learning about the different theories behind concepts, but then giving people an experiential opportunity to apply those. I love this acronym ACT. You know, it really is about creating change makers out in the world, and we can't help transform the world or others or communities within the world if we haven't gone through some sort of transformational experience ourselves. So we like to make people really uncomfortable here at Railroads. And sport, of course, has been an overarching topic, that, like climate for us, or peace, because it offers so many avenues for exploring these tough topics like gender equity or inclusion and diversity, the concept of sport washing, right, and the rhetoric around sport. lots of great topics that we can explore. We have some coursework around sport and society, but these kind of overarching topics are something that guide all of our schools. We have partnerships as well that link to sport. I just finished my 3rd cohort of CFL players and others from the sport community join in with the course, but it's really motivated by the CFL Players Association Player Academy. Wonderful, great times. We also, I think, one of our policies is around flexible admission. So we honor the learning that you're doing within your professional practice. So if you've been working for the government for 15 years, we acknowledge that for credit. We do the same thing for elite athletes who have learned a great deal competing and training at the international level. This is my student, Andrea Burke, who took a leave from her master's degree to go win a silver medal at the World Cup and then came back and finished off looking at culture and communication within rugby Canada. And so here we are with this webinar series where monthly we spend some time discussing what we can learn in sport, but also through sport. What can sport teach us, but what could we also improve within sport? And I would say the former today will be the focus of our conversation. We've been noticing a lot of different challenges in our sport system in Canada, specifically and globally, but we've come up against some pretty tough situations in sport in Canada. And I think Canadians are really calling for a paradigm shift. How can we, what's it going to take, for Canada to really enjoy a sport that's yes, sure, high performing and successful, but also safe and healthy and fun. We were just having a great conversation before we started amongst the panel about where's the fun factor. It's supposed to be fun. So welcome to our panelists today. We've got Taylor McKee, who's an assistant professor in sport management at Brock University. I did my undergrad there, have I'm definitely a Badger through and through, and I love Brock, but we've met at a couple of conferences and in other contexts that Taylor just reminded me of. He's analyzing the sociocultural intersections of sport and society, and I'll be tapping him to teach the courses that I'm developing right now. Scott Ramsey is a registered nurse and works at UBC, has his doctorate in nursing, and he's an advocate for concussion prevention, former professional hockey player, and advocates for eliminating fighting and raising the age with body checking for junior hockey players. And I think, this all feeds into this discussion around how do we make it safe, healthy, but also fun, and also high performing. We're aggressive, we're athletes, we want to try hard. And then Tim Scoose. So lovely to have met Tim recently and been introduced to him by my good friend Wendy McGregor, who was on our last webinar. He's an associate professor at Brandon U and asserts the notion of masculinity is not a fixed or stable construct. Rather, it can be reinterpreted to provide other alternatives of what it means to be an elite athlete, I would say, not just hockey. But, we've had a few people on the webinar talking about hockey as a case where we see these, the roles of capitalism, supremacy, imperialism, colonialism, and the patriarchy really taking hold and creating some pretty problematic experiences for people. So let's get started. I've got a few questions to guide us. I want to welcome the panelists and the participants to pose questions on their own. You can pose those in the chat or signal to us that you'd like to put your mic on and share some comments or a question. I've got some contact information for everybody and wanted to highlight too that our next webinar will have something to do with the waves of change we're seeing in women's sport. The galvanizing support for sport for women is just tremendous to see. So it's time to talk about that. All right, let's get going. And welcome everybody. Great to see everybody come on, even though I was sort of lame with promoting this webinar. So I'm really appreciative to Ariana who reminded people today, and for all of you who are joining us. Great to see you, Spider, here from up north. And I've got my buddy Clarence from out in Mississauga. Great to see you, my student from the sport leadership course that we just did with CFL players too, Andres Marquez. Okay, and welcome everybody. Great to see you here. Let's get started. I always give a very cursory introduction to our panelists, but I welcome them now to also share a little bit more about themselves. but also about in the context of sport, what is it that drew you to sport? How can you describe either your path into sport or your current relationship with sport? Like, what is it that's caused you to commit time to sport, both professionally and personally, as a researcher and as a professional, but also as a human being? And is there anybody who'd like to start? Okay, I'm going to pick someone, Tim, and then we'll have Taylor and then Scott on deck. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Yeah, one of the things that I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University, but my area that I focus on when I'm at Brandon is social studies. And in particular with social studies, I think something I have found provocative, I think from an early age, is the notion of the existential questions around notions of identity. And trying to connect that, then I played hockey and football and multiple sports coming up. So I'm thinking, how did I come to be and to understand what it was to be a boy and a man in and through the institutions of the sports that I played? And one of the things that I think when I'm thinking about the question that you've posed is, I remember, and this is a very familiar trope that I think all of us have heard at some point, is I remember, playing hockey at a very young age and a coach telling me to, be a man or to man up. And I think, again, that's a familiar trope. But one of the things that I think I intuitively knew as a 12 or 13-year-old, he wasn't necessarily commanding me to be what I thought or who I was as a boy. He was actually, I think, commending certain virtues as what he concerned him that must define essential maleness. So it wasn't that to be a man wasn't say, oh, what you think that is in the sporting context. It was, I think there's a real, and I think most men and boys who play the game, when that's said to them, there's a certain narrative that's attached to that. So I think I have been trying to work through that question and the role of hockey and these kinds of markers as to what it was to be a boy and a man for my entire life. So it wasn't episodic that these things are said and we forget them. I think this is a profound question that through sport, it was magnified to say, well, what is it to be a boy and a man? And I don't think there was a lot of bandwidth to multiple kinds of ways and multiple ways to understand that particular notion. So what brings me to this particular research too is that I have a young son who's playing the game, and narratives that I heard 40 years ago, he's still hearing them. And the question that I think still sits on my shoulder is, he came home as an 11-year-old and said, Dad, do I have to learn how to trash talk? And I think it's one of those moments where you think, what is happening in the game? Then an 11-year-old can come to his father and say to me, do I have to treat humans this way? So I'll just end with, I remember doing the Shakespearean play in high school was Hamlet saying to be or not to be. And I think it's often interpreted as to stay alive or to commit suicide. But I also think sport teaches us how to be. And these are the questions that I think I want to move to the center to say, what is it to be? And how ought we to be within the sporting context and beyond?
Madly taking notes, and also looked up Joe Ehrman talks about that, be a man, has a wonderful TED talk on that I'll post as well. But we'll come around to that question. I'm gathering all of these and make sure that we get to it. How should we be in sport? It's a great question. Thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, Tim, that was wonderful. That's a wonderful way to get this discussion started. My own journey, my academic discipline is and was history. I was fascinated by historical studies. Wasn't until my master's that I realized that a study of sport in an academic sense was even possible. I was already well into a graduate degree. I was studying notions of resistance within French existentialism in post-World War II France. Notions of resistance have always been an academic passion of mine. My doctoral work and my master's work ended up being about resistance to violence within the game of hockey. And my doctoral work focused on expressions of resistance to violence, because one of the things, and look, Tim already brought it up already, one of the things you will hear frequently when you're hearing about hockey, specifically in Canadian sport culture in general, is you know, hey, if you think it's bad now, you should have seen it in 1985 when it was really rough. And if you would have spoken to someone in 1985, they would have said, you know, I think it's bad in the 80s. You should have seen it in the 60s. You would have spoken to someone in the 60s, they would have talked to you about the 40s. We could keep going all the way back. And if you would have spoke to someone in 1875, the year of the first organized game of hockey in Canada, they would have said, we hate the violence that we see. I mean, it's all over newsprint, it's all over everywhere. There has been resistance to violence in hockey as long as there's been violence in hockey. And I think that one of the phenomenons that we see over and over again is this notion that our modern condition is we are the first ones to find something wrong with a lot of the things that Tim was bringing up there, but a lot of the hyper masculine tropes that are drilled into children as young as 8, 9, 7 years old, younger than that even. We're not the first people to think that this is a little strange, but we have this notion of suppression throughout Canadian sport history that says, well, you know, there's a proper way to be a Canadian athlete, and that applies to basketball players. Fred VanVleet loses a tooth in a basketball game, and they said, "You're really Canadian now," and his response basically was like, "If this means being Canadian, I don't want any part of this." And it was sort of like this reminder that there's notions of Canadianness and manliness, as Tim sort of brought up there, that permeate throughout all sports. So my own journey with here was about studying resistance in sport, specifically as an expression of violence. My own research now, we do demographic research in Indigenous hockey players, specifically in the sport, specifically in the province of Manitoba. We just came back from the National Aboriginal Hockey Championships in Grand Prairie, Alberta, where Team Manitoba medaled. Last year they won gold and silver. This year they won double bronzes. And we study the demographic characteristics that have made Manitoba so successful at producing elite hockey players at the junior level, grounded in the strengths and hopes perspectives, and we can get into that in a little bit perhaps, but Manitoba has been such an unbelievable success story in terms of elite Indigenous athletes, specifically in hockey. We're looking at ways that we can try and recapitulate that in other provinces throughout Canada. That's sort of my brief journey into sport.
Oh, so interesting. And, you know, we're seeing this thread that really links all four with around violence and, you know, why, what's going on, how does it show up? The resistance is there, but it's just always been there and doesn't seem to be really shifting all that much. We'll see. Thank you, Taylor. I really want to come back to the Canadian cultural values that are underpinning this too, because I've often dreamt of doing a study on, you know, what do Canadians really love about sport? It's a bit frightening, actually, because I think we want to knock people's teeth out, and I'm not sure I want to hear that. All right, Scott, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your path?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Jennifer. So my name is Dr. Scott Ramsey. I'm a member of BC Métis Nation. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation today, also known as North Vancouver. I'm now an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at UBC. I'm a nurse clinician in BC Children's in outpatient neurology. I've worked there for 7 years now in neurology and a couple of years bedside in acute care prior to that. What else about me? In terms of sport, I was a high-level hockey player over a decade ago. Played 4 years in the Western Hockey League. Made it all the way to NHL camp with the Anaheim Ducks before, unfortunately, having to retire due to multiple concussions. I had 3 concussions in 13 months, which ultimately led to my retirement. While I was in undergraduate nursing school, I became interested in the notion of policy change and the impact that policy can have on preventing injuries. And so I was a research assistant on the BC portion of the study that looked at the policy change of removing body checking from non-elite ice hockey in Canada, which then went on to be implemented nationwide. And so as someone who has over 70 plus junior fights, NHL fights, suffered multiple concussions and is now living with the impacts of those, I think I feel not so much from a research perspective, but a personal advocacy perspective, that there needs to be a strong paradigm shift in hockey to remove fighting, to remove body checking at younger levels. I think personally, knowing what I do with children's health and development, you know, I always use the example of saying, imagine a 16-year-old fighting in front of 5,000 people and someone's getting paid millions of dollars, aka an owner of a junior hockey team, and they're making money off this. It seems so wrong on so many different levels, right? So through all that, I've, with my retirement, I no longer play hockey, but I've coached hockey for over a decade. And so really what the crux of my personal experience and research get down to is I essentially want to prevent something happening in terms of multiple concussions, post-concussion syndrome, to individuals, so they don't have to experience what I went through. Because when I describe it, I essentially describe it as like 2 years of hell. It was awful having to live through that. And so if we can prevent that from happening to anyone in the future, even if it's just one person, in my mind, we've made a difference. So.
Oh, right on. Yes, thank you. And so let's build on that. What is it about the fighting and the violence and the body checking in this particular sport, do you think? Can we try to unpack that and understand it a little bit more? Because you've all looked at it. You've all been looking at, especially that sport, right? This is one of the things that unifies all three. And so what do you think some of the factors are that continue, that make it prevalent, but then it continues and continues, or make people resistant to stopping the violence as well? What do you think's going on? Scott, do you want to keep going?
Sure. The simple answer is it's multifaceted. And maybe I'll pick off because I feel like I'm not as much of an expert in the academic background as Tim and Taylor are, but I can maybe speak from an athlete and coach's perspective, and that's because it's ingrained in the rules, right? So if we look at the rules currently, coaching U15, that is when you first come into body contact in male hockey. In female hockey, there's not any body checking. So there we see a discrepancy, in my opinion, already. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And if we go up a level into junior, well, so when you turn 16 years of age, then you can fighting is introduced. And so within the rules and the culture, so to speak, of the game, body checking and fighting is implemented at various levels of hockey. And so coming from a pediatric nurse researcher perspective, in my mind, there's ample opportunities where we're exposing and putting children at risk of potentially sustaining concussions, injuries unnecessarily where we don't have to. So maybe I'll just pick off that one kind of example that, it's built within the inherent culture of the game within the rules.
And the cultural artifacts, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing the rules, the policies, how it's being introduced, what the penalties are being given for. Yeah. So, and then I loved how you called out the underlying assumption of there are men being paid, usually men, not always, but individuals being paid a lot of money to watch a 15-year-old have a fight in front of 5,000 people. So calling that out, I think, is really powerful. Thank you for doing that. Tim, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm building on what Scott was talking, but I just been rereading Bell Hook's book, and it's The Will to Change Men, Masculinity, and Love. And one of the lines that I think was provoked by what Scott was talking about is this: patriarchal violence is a mental illness. And it's a profound to think of the implications of that kind of violence that is actually, I think, embedded within the culture of hockey that Scott was talking about. One of the things I think, maybe to piggyback or to further that thinking or that thought, it's also embedded with a culture of silence. So I remember interviewing one athlete, he's a current pro at the time, talked about the fear of man-to-man violence among men. But he also said it drove it into a silence. He says, who was I to tell? Where was I to go? Am I going to go to a teammate and say, I'm living in fear on the ice? And he talked about a particular case when he was playing in Montreal against the Boston Bruins. He was not a huge man, although he played a fourth line kind of role. he was intimidated to the point, he said, by this one Boston player, said, if you go near our stars, I will, expletive, kill you. And he said he lived an entire year living in that fear and questioning his own quote unquote toughness. So one of the things I think I would like to really have people comment on is that the men that I've interviewed, and Taylor, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, that talk about being afraid of other men, but internalizing it as their own lack and not a systemic critique of why there is violence and fighting in the game. So I think that's a really profound thing to think about, is the silence around men who internalize their own lack, that they can't live up to this ideal, which I don't think any man can, and not a systemic critique or an ethical challenge to what they're being asked to do.
And is it okay if I just jump right into there? I mean, that's such a great, I mean, I'm so thrilled to just even be hearing what's being shared here. This is amazing. And, just to directly address that point of when you speak to people who have experienced it, like what Scott just gave us right there, that his own personal journey here. One of the common refrains actually directly relates to something that Scott brought up here, which is to say, why is this occurring? Why is this happening? Why are we internalizing the pressures to harm the way that we do? The rule set is a great place to start. Honest to goodness, that the rule set is a really, really important part of this. Explain fighting as described by Scott with 5,000 people to Europeans. It's difficult to do, where they're like, well, fighting is this thing that goes on. If you're explaining to someone who has no familiarity with the game of hockey, and it's a really simple exercise, describing how the rule mechanisms work, where the game stops, the clock stops, both teams are penalized with according to the rule book, a major penalty with no disadvantage. The rule set itself provides a space for fighting specifically that says this isn't really part of the game, even though it is a part of the game. I mean, unequivocally, it has been for this many years. So that sort of internal inertia is so important to address right away. We do get rid of fighting frequently in hockey, like at the Olympics, like in the Stanley Cup Finals. It happens all the time. Those are some of the highest rated games that we want to go to from a sport management perspective. We say that, it's the dollars, cents, the entertainment value. There's a very, very entertaining hockey without really this sort of notion of fighting. But again, this notion of why it is that it is permitted in this way, and why it is that we have these pressures. I mean, again, the code of silence, or the notion of silence, is so important here, because it also gets into a darker space here when it comes to how we can have abusive structures inside of hockey, and how we can have predators, take advantage of these spaces. Hockey is a sport in Canada specifically, and obviously Scott can speak to this personally, but you are dislocated so young, so very young in hockey. If you're going to try and make it in hockey, and this is something that is accelerated, not slowing down, you have to leave home. And, if you want to go through, if you have a look at the junior A system, for instance, in Western Canada specifically, and you want to say play junior A hockey in Manitoba, if say you played in Winnipeg growing up, or a suburb of Winnipeg, I mean, you could play your junior hockey in Selkirk, you could be playing your junior hockey in Wawasee-Capo, you could be playing your junior hockey all throughout the province of Manitoba with hours and hours and hours on a bus. You're playing and living in these places. This is far from home. You've probably had to move once before that if you're going to get to junior A. And when you're there, you are utterly dependent on that coach and that sort of movement up. So if that coach asks you to do something you're not comfortable with when it comes to your roles on the ice, you're going to do it, because your way of getting out of Selkirk and getting out of, Weyburn, Saskatchewan, these are wonderful places, but maybe that's not home for you. And you want to obviously, move up the ladder. You have to do what you're asked. And that's true in all sports. I'll say that. Like that is true in soccer, and that's true in football. That's the way you have to do what's asked of you as coach. But the difference in hockey is that level of liability, that level of personal stakes that come along with it. That you could be asked to get your face punched in by a grown man, and you are compensated with a per diem that is an insult to the notion of professionalism. So, I mean, that's something that is so unbelievably unique and special about the game of hockey, that most Canadian hockey fans walk around with an operationalized understanding of, but have never critically interrogated. I mean, the junior hockey model is just so utterly bizarre that I think if you spent a little bit of time thinking about it, where exactly the power structures that you mentioned there, these privately run teams some of them do very, very, very well. Players are barely compensated at all. Most of them not really compensated. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And The last thing I'll speak to is something that I've noticed in my role here at Brock. I have a large undergraduate classrooms, and I like to describe Brock. It's the largest sport management program in the country, but it is sort of in the beating white hot core of sport fans in the country. And these students that come in first year, a lot of them want to be Kyle Dubas, and they want to, but a lot of them are almost the vast overwhelming majority of them are from the GTA. This is a perfect laboratory setting for hockey fans. And I would have expected a lot of this to be a sort of fossilized version of the game from my grandparents and my parents, right? A version of the game that no longer exists. And that's the problem. And what's all we need is for younger people to take over. And once this new generation takes hold, then we'll slough off all these notions of masculinity. And truly, honestly, it's not the case. In some senses, I honestly feel like there has been, in the last 10 years or so, a real renaissance for really archaic forms of masculine expression in the game of hockey, and a real recalcitrance to notions of change within it. Look no further than the way that which people under the age of 25 thought about the treatment of Don Cherry, a man who, for them, most of those people, my students here, virulently were defending Don Cherry when he was being ousted from sports, and they have no memories of Don Cherry with color in his hair. I mean, their version of Don Cherry is a cartoon character for the most part, right? I mean, and still, they were so happy to recapitulate the same notion of hockey that their parents had and their grandparents had. So I think it's foolish to imagine that this is only the fault of, the baby boomer generation, or, a version of the game that's long gone. Young people have absorbed these values and are more than happy to push them through. I mean, again, we have a hazing incident in the KIJHL in BC. The coaches were 23 and 24. I mean, and again, this stemmed from a line brawl incident that came along with it. Like, again, this is not an age-related thing. It is certainly deep within the tissue of Canadian hockey culture.
And I love this, you're linking all these threads. I'm thinking back to Tim's point about it, the kind of hyper masculinity being almost a mental illness. You're describing kind of a cult-like scenario here, a narcissistic cult-like scenario where we remove people from their families on purpose, right? And then they are very vulnerable. There's no way you can give consent because you're in a position of complete power imbalance. Why are we not interrogating? Why are we not interrogating? Why is there no critique, to Tim's point? Why are we not changing the rules when we have been able to change the rules in certain situations? What do you think? Like, I just want to keep digging. Go ahead, Scott.
So as someone who had a grandparent go to residential school, what you just described there, and like what Taylor described to a T, is the junior hockey system is uprooting and removing these children from their homes so they can go and be immersed in this culture, right? Like, it's assimilation into hockey culture is what I call it. I don't know if other people feel comfortable saying that, but I was asked to move out when I was 15, and my mom said no. She refused to let me move to Wilcox, Saskatchewan. If everyone knows that, it's Notre Dame. And I'm so thankful that she did. But like it's individual situations, and what happens is all these individual situations get put together on a team, and then we get this group mentality, right? We get this gang, this cult-like culture where people gang up on individuals, and that's like that team mentality. But what the first thing that came to mind, and my experience through it, is it's a business, right? People make money, and so as long as people are making money from these capitalist institutions, they're not going to change them, because look at MLSE. They're not going to want to change anything. They're making millions, billions of dollars a year. Why would they want to change anything? That's the first thing that pops into my mind is having experienced it. And really, when you play junior hockey, you don't realize, but you're just a number. They don't care about you. They don't care about your well-being. You're not producing. They'll trade you. They'll cut you. They'll send you home. It's a business, is what it comes down to at the bottom line of all this.
And I'd say even in the amateur realm, there's a bit of that. It's not as big of bucks, but there are people's jobs who are relying on you.
Well, now with the uprising of
yes,
the hockey academies, and I don't know if they have those back east. I know they're very prevalent in Western Canada and in BC, But with the hockey academies, those are people's livings. Like people make hundreds of $1,000s a year. And people, are remortgaging their homes so their 13, 14-year-old can go hockey, might have a chance to play junior hockey. And so it gets treated like a business even at that amateur level. And the culture and hostility towards like how coaches treat children is abusive. It's abusive because if you're not producing, then the coach doesn't look good, and the whole slippery slope. And I feel like I don't have to explain that to this crowd. But I feel, and I agree with it, like I feel like it's almost digressed in the sense that we've taken a step back now with this, and we've brought this model at the junior level down into the amateur level in that sense. So that's where I'll leave it at that. I'll let Tim and Taylor.
Tim, go for it.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting too is I think when I was, and Taylor, I'd be interested to hear when you work on resistance, but when I was working with some athletes who were elite level hockey players in the resistance, one of the things that kept coming up, and I think it's really important to think of the narratives that we tell about the game. And one of the things that the men that I interviewed would often say, well, it's natural that men behave in certain kinds of ways. It's foregone conclusion that that's what we do. In fact, if men are aggressive and violent, there's a reward for that within the context of hockey. So one of the things that I thought, well, how do we then make the language that we're using with young athletes explicit? So when they talk about what it is to be a man or a boy, that's the heart of the conversation. It sits there. And I think there's an interesting phrase that I've come across recently that time cannot work on what is frozen. How do we loosen up the narratives and make the familiar unfamiliar? And I think that might be the space to launch into other narratives that we might tell. And maybe just to make this more concrete, one of the things that I find interesting, and I've heard this for a number of years with regards to fighting, that fighting allows men, kind of lets the cork off the bottle. The pressure gets released and it's a one and done and they move on. In short, they refer to it as episodic. The research and the men that I've interviewed, violence and fights and the shame that can come along with it lasts a lifetime. This isn't one and done. This permeates into people's psyche, their sense of who they are, being embarrassed on the ice. How do they deal with beating somebody up? I had lots of men talk about their guilt that they felt and then say, well, where do I go to reconcile some of these abuses and violence that I've inflicted on other men? So I think really to make the familiar unfamiliar. So when we talk about what's natural, it is a problematic notion, not a foregone conclusion, that we can look at languages and maybe talk about these narratives in different kinds of ways.
And so who could do that? I love this idea of unfreezing. That's Kurt Levine, right? Where you unfreeze before you try to change something. So how do we shake it up? How do we loosen? How do we challenge? I mean, I think all of you are doing that through your various channels, but clearly we feel like we need to do it more. Who else can help? What do you think, Taylor?
I mean, it's a great question. I think that ultimately this requires leadership, unfortunately, from a particular set of people that on these issues have been found wanting. And that is, of course, players at the very top. Because again, it is remarkable. And if you're into the sort of social media world of hockey, if you have a Instagram Reels or TikTok that sort of bring this stuff to you, one of the things that I found really remarkable about it when you sort of sample this is what age in which the things that we've talked about here become enculturated in these players. What age do they learn what's expected of them, right? And if you ask that of players, again, if you ask the sporting public or the sports fans public in terms of when would I think that a hockey player becomes, to use less crude language, like when does a hockey bro become a hockey bro, right? And is the answer, so like the non-sporting public would say 15, 16, right? The truth is, and if you watch social media or if you look at these, like there's even this group of people who are actually around my neck of the woods here, and they do interviews with players who are novice players who are 7 years old, and they do it, and it's meant to be funny. They use exclusively hockey language, very like, in fact, it would sound like an alien tongue to 90% of the world. But the humor is elicited to the fact that these people sound exactly like the broiest versions of hockey bros that you'd ever see, and they're 7 and 8 years old. And the truth is that age in which they become acculturated and where they become essentially masculine products or even finished products in terms of closing their minds to what it is, as Tim was saying, like what it is to be a man, the age is much younger and it's getting younger all the time. And that's a huge problem. So in terms of who can fix this, we're asking professional athletes half the time, elite professional athletes. And I mean, Jen and Scott, you know exactly what it takes to get there. At no stage during your journeys to become elite athletes are you taught how to become professional communicators or to think critically about notions of gender or power dynamics. That's not part of it, right? It's unreasonable to expect that. But we see it working in other sports where it just so happens some of these athletes have informed opinions on different issues. We see the way that the discourse around race in America changes when Jaylen Brown goes and talks about it. It's like, look, if I'm a Celtics fan, I hear Jaylen Brown saying, you don't know what it's like to be black in America. I mean, maybe if I'm a white Celtics fan, I'm more likely to listen to that. Now, I'm not saying we need Connor McDavid going out there and, challenging our notions of masculinity, but damn, it wouldn't hurt, right? I mean, it wouldn't hurt to have those types of people think critically about it. But right now, the reason that is such a laughable notion is that it is seen in this archetypical sort of robotic production line Canadian hockey player personality type is something that a lot of players are quite proud of. It's something that, like, this notion of singular devotion, the sort of Captain Serious moniker given to Jonathan Toews as an example, it's seen as a point of national pride, how disconnected these people are from the world around them, how singularly focused they are. It's something that people celebrate all the time. They look for this in draft profiles. If you'll see the draft coming up, you're going to hear this guy's he lives and breathes hockey. It's like, I assume everyone about to be drafted in the NHL lives and breathes hockey. Like, I think that that's probably not something that we need to keep overemphasizing, but this notion of, like, look, who's going to end up changing it? I'd love it to be leading from the front from one of these athletes that are there. It's just highly unlikely. And this is another sort of, like, there's a series of chickens and a series of eggs problems here, because I don't know how to fit. Do we have to change it first at the grassroots and then hope to mature better pros? Maybe. Or do you need the pros to demonstrate leadership? But, whether it's the rule set themselves, the impetus to change based on sort of capitalist forces that Scott was describing, I mean, or whether or not it's this sort of noxious gendered notions that are sort of seeping all throughout hockey culture that Tim was describing. Either way, we need leadership from those who are involved and receiving the big paychecks. And unfortunately, there's no incentives currently aligned to make that happen.
That's where every group I participated, we circled back to, where's the incentive? Like, what's actually going to make people want to change all of these things, right? Right now, the rewards are for the noxious, for the bro, for the, for the academies where you're going to, and it just continues to confirm the same kind of mindsets. Well, where are the incentives? Like, what's it going to actually take to shift? What do you think? I'm going off script here quite a bit, but I feel like everybody's invested and can go off script with me. What do you think the hockey scandal is going? What kind of impact do you think that might have, or do you think it will just kind of be PR'd out of our consciousness again, Scott?
I mean, okay, so someone who's played and coached and when I heard all the news about everything that happened in terms of, I'll just use broadly like the Team Canada incidents. It was not surprising. And so I think I don't know if that was rock bottom. I don't know if there'll be a more rock bottom moment, but I think what has to happen in hockey specifically is there needs to be a like, this is the basement, here we are, we need to take a step back and figure this out. And I'm saying that in the sense that is what has happened enough that the executives at Hockey Canada being removed, and now we have different executives forming that, and there's starting to be some gender equity in there, and hockey's the old boys club. It's really what it is, right? And so by bringing representation, equity, diversity into hockey, people can start to see themselves be in there. And I think, using the Celtics example, I never grew up seeing like any other Indigenous hockey players. Like, I knew I was Indigenous, but it wasn't until after I retired from hockey that I really seeked out my Indigenous roots, because it was non-existent in hockey. And so once we start having more and more representation in hockey, and we begin to see that's someone I can look up to. And so maybe this is an answer to Taylor's question. It is, maybe it does need to start with the pros. Maybe it does need to be someone standing up and saying, I can see myself being like that one day. I think that will have a trickle down effect. And so whether that's a player or that's someone in an executive leadership position, taking charge and saying that, this needs to change. The question that I have is what has happened in the change enough? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, Catherine Henderson, now the new CEO, but we're not hearing from her. It'd be great to hear from her. I mean, I think a lot of us could call on her to speak out a little more and give us some more updates and show that accountability, transparency. We've got the PWHL now, right? And those women are doing a great job of being the faces of a new kind of hockey. There's a lot of there's so much. I mean, the public is really galvanized around that league, which is great to see, disproving the argument that we don't bring in the box office, but we are. We're filling stadiums. So there is change, but there's also a very palpable, yes, thank you, Scott, a palpable sense of that Renaissance regression, archaic. I feel that it's almost like the equal opposite reaction, like we see with the Trump after Obama. We get somewhere and then we're back 2 steps again. So there seems to definitely be a resistance to progress. Keep going. Where else do you see? Yeah, go, Tim. Where do you see the levers for change?
It's interesting how when people start talking what gets provoked. But one of the things I found in the research I was conducting is this embrace of stoicism, that men are to be composed, lack emotion. Again, I think I've said this earlier, but this silencing about what men are feeling when they're asked to do certain things or the experiences they're living. And as Scott said, I think there's a fairly narrow set of tracks of what's permissible and what's advocated for in elite level hockey, at least. So one of the things that I'm wondering about too, I've heard men talk about living in exile, that one man said, he's a NHLer for 10 years, said, it feels like I have to wear 2 capes. I have to fit the brand when I'm playing hockey, but it rubs up against who I want to be in the world with my kids, my partner, and other relationships. And he found they didn't stay isolated in the rink. So the ideas of being conforming to certain ideals on the rink, there's no barrier that keeps it there. And he felt those behaviors were also permeating into his intimate relationships with family, friends, and partners. So one of the things, maybe it goes back to what both Taylor and Scott are talking about, is how about having those conversations with elite level NHLers that start to talk about the very things, the phenomena of what it's like to engage in a fight, the phenomena of what it's like to live in fear of other men, the phenomena of these things. So I would take it that I think it would be an interesting thing to hear men reveal that. I'm also very interested to hear how the young what they might say about their experiences in hockey. And they're already responding, as Taylor, as early as 7 years of age, starting to go, wait a minute. And when I heard athletes talk, they would say, it's not in my constitution to behave this way. So they're feeling like they're exiled in a way of who they are. They're forced, or they feel like they must harmonize with this image, and it's not what they want to be or to do. So I'm wondering if both ends of this, from a grassroots young athletes saying, this is how I'm feeling when I'm asked to do this, and when my coach says this to me, and older athletes in the NHL to saying, here is the lived experience of what you think is so romantic on television. It ain't so.
And you're making me think of Christy Alain out in, where is she? Out in Fredericton, I think, New Brunswick. And she's interviewed older she calls them old man hockey. And when they share, where they're at now and how wonderful it is to be able to actually just express and be friends and have fun and not be kind of held to that, whatever it is, that hypermasculine or the stoicism or the inability to actually express. And like you say, there's bell hooks again, right? That really having a lot of compassion for the trap that men find themselves in, that is the patriarchy. So I'll put Christy Ellen in there, but a little more about that. Let's keep diving into that phenomenon. Calling all researchers, let's do some more work into helping these people to share what's going on. We see like what's real, what the phenomenon really feels like. We do see more and more people speaking out about the mental health challenges that they face because of, like Scott, I experienced multiple head injuries because of this sport and because of the pressure I felt to engage in these activities. And now I'm suffering the consequences. And lots of people are speaking out about that now. We can definitely amplify that platform. And I love the idea of, calling on those elite athletes to speak about the values that we're seeking, resisting the violence, but also sharing the challenges of actually participating in this culture that is so destructive.
Yeah. I mean, just to return to the point you had earlier, Jen, asking about, the when you address the scandals, and it's enormously depressing that we need to be precise. Which scandal are we referring to? If you say the hockey scandal, are we talking about, and if I said the World Junior team, I'd say which World Junior team, of which there are two large, high profile, truly. And again, when Scott says there that he wasn't surprised, I mean, that is I think, a very, very, very common. This is my same reaction. Horrified but not surprised is, I think, the way that most people are, where it's like, we just can't dull ourselves to what actually occurred there. Like Robin Doolittle's reporting there from 2018 is, it shivers your timbers. It is truly horrifying in any context. So it's just so important to just note that. But of course it wasn't surprising, because of course we are, if you're familiar with this, it's such a toxic swamp. But the thing that really bothered me in reading the I think even Robin Doolittle was able to find some of the leaked exchanges between the alleged assaulters and the victim, is something that I think gets at why I don't know if using elite athletes is going to be the way for hockey. And that's because there's this temptation where it's like, okay, so what do we do? We have a fairly broad consensus that this is a problem. Hockey culture is broken. Let's fix it. And we try, and I think, and I say here, maybe as academics, is, okay, well, it needs to be a seminar or some sort of education piece. There needs to be education pieces. And you know what? Maybe 30 years ago, that might be true. Like maybe 30 years ago, there needs to be a more broad discussion about what is proper and what is allowed. Sheldon Kennedy expresses this notion quite passionately and very, almost aggressively. No one needs to be reminded what criminal rape is. And the situation in 2018, those players knew exactly what had happened. And when they were texting back and forth, they were, to speak to Tim's notion of silence here, we're getting into a silence that is only akin to organized crime, a level of omerta, which is to say, you're not going to say anything or else, ... right? And that was not just among the victim, it was among teammates. This is one of the problems that I have, is that like a lot of the outcomes, a lot of the things we try and do to fix it are this notion that, well, it's born out of ignorance. It's not born in many senses. If you're looking at a junior hockey player now who's, say, 23 years old, they're going to have had safe sport training likely 5, 6, 7, 8 times in their junior career. They're going to have had people who've tried their very best to change things. And well, I don't want to sound like an alarmist about these things, but one of the things that's deeply troubling is the level of awareness and the level of conceptual grasping of how illicit the activities are is not dissuading people from doing them. In fact, it's kind of what fuels it. Now, there is this wretched fossil from 20 years ago called the Junior Hockey Bible that still exists in dark corners of the internet. And it was from the early 21st century. And it was this thing that existed in very shady, there was this website, Gong Show Hockey, that had the Junior Hockey Bible, and it had this dictionary attached to it of just the worst, most horrifying things you could imagine as things that would go on as a part of junior hockey, part of normal. Now, a lot of it it's supposed to be done out of a matter of humor, but again, it's always with hockey, you never quite know what is meant to be a joke and what is not. A lot of them explicitly mentioned sexual acts to be done to women, and most of them said bonus points if recorded. Now, again, this Junior Hockey Bible was exactly contemporary with the situation that went on in 2003. I'm not suggesting causation here. What I'm suggesting is no one needed to be reminded that like raping and filming a woman in 2003, this is not 1901 here. I mean, like this is they knew what was going on was wrong, prohibited, and even criminal. And in 2018, that was the case as well. So the problem is, to what level can we expect anyone who's come to the very, very, very highest levels here, who've been raised through that system, who've had to deal with that level of omerta, that level of like, I'm not going to say anything because I saw some stuff that I probably should have acted out about. So I'm not going to be on the front lines of this issue because somebody knows that I was there at some point in time. That's really brutal. If you think about what Cale Makar, who was on the 2018 team, said when asked about this, you know, he said, I think it was maybe a careless comment. Maybe it was a Freudian slip. I don't know. But he said it was a really fortunate bounce that he wasn't there at the day of the alleged gang assault of that woman. He described it as like a lucky break. Like, what are we talking about here? Like, what do you mean it was you were lucky not to be there? Essentially saying that, like, look, I was going to be, if the team was there and I was present, I was going to be there. So that level of just accepting what is normal in that way is deeply troubling. But I really, really, really am hesitant to suggest that like this is a lack of education anymore. I think maybe 5-6 years ago, I thought that was maybe perhaps something that we could use to fix it. I think that they generally know what's going on when it happens, especially as it involves the treatment of women, is illicit. And that's sort of what draws people to it. So it's a question of, you know, what can be done and what are the incentives? Because that was another one of your questions, Jen, and I promise. I'm sorry, I'll shut up here. I don't want to ramble. But there are enough carrots, okay? There's plenty of carrots. I mean, Scott, Tim, Jen, you know all about the carrots, okay? The carrots are the money and the adulation, and there are plenty of carrots. We need better sticks, okay? Like, look, when they banned anyone from representing Canada who was on the 2018 team, they said, well, it's not fair to the players that weren't there. That's precisely the point, okay? Yes, it is not fair. Look, shutting down the entire World Junior program, that's something that's a possibility. Is that fair to people? No. But I mean, like, look, this is entertainment. This is not a necessity, okay? To speak back to what Scott was talking about, of course, that's never going to happen because, of course, TSN, Nike, and all these other people make a ton of money on this product. But let's not act like those things are not weapons at our disposal. And the players themselves know, and they know right now, they're playing a game of legal chicken right now with this, with the trial that's coming up. They're saying, look, we're going to have 5 attorneys cross-examining one victim. If you're comfortable with that, go for it. If not, drop the charges. And they're sort of saying, you're going to forget about it. You're going to be more interested in where Carter Hart's playing his pro hockey in 5 years. We're going to wait you out. And that has been a very successful strategy so far. So, I mean, am I optimistic that the incentives are going to work? Any even more carrots? Probably not. We need to start getting very, very, very draconian with the punishments, because I feel like that's the only type of communication that's going to work.
Yeah, back to rules, I mean, it's sport, right? When you change the rules, then things change. I always say, you know, sit around a round table compared to an oblong table, everybody behaves differently. So we know that works. It's kind of the opposite of cultural change from we're looking to change the fundamental assumptions governing it, that it's okay to do these horrible things. And what can we do structurally where we have some power and levers for change and advocacy that will then change those assumptions and make them impossible to live out, perhaps, hey? Lots of great things. You know, I do think there needs to be compassion around those who are, like bell hooks would argue, that people are trapped in these cultural mores and the norms and the expectations, and men have a lot to lose if they try to fight back against some of those expectations, because they'll be booted out of the club. And it seems to me as a woman that that's more significant than it is for a woman. Worth talking about. You know, what's the role of the elite athletes who have the platform? Do they speak out? Can they speak out? Can they share their actual experiences? Can we create spaces and time for them to be able to do that? What other things do you want to bring up? Go ahead, Tim.
Just, you know, it's, I was thinking about this one former NHLer that I interviewed, and I guess the broader topic that I guess is more of it's not that I have an answer to this or response to this, but be interesting to hear people's notions of how might we understand and create space for reconciliation? And I know that's not an easy thing to throw out there with million-dollar athletes and coming forth that should have known better. So, but I think, can we sit in that space for a while to talk about reconciliation? And what provoked me was this one NHLer, after some stories break and they open up to certain, I had never thought that when I was playing, said to this gentleman, they used to call this player the chocolate rocket. And he said, the more publicity that comes around these notions of how people used to be treated and still are treated, men are coming out of long histories of 30, 40 years sometimes to apologize to how they were treating each other, either on the ice, in the locker room, or et cetera. So how might there be the notion around how do we reconcile that men who wear this in a heavy kind of way, what spaces and places do we engage in this kind of conversations, and what might that look and sound like?
Mhm. Do you think the Future of Sport Commission can play a role? You know, can we appeal to Andrew Pipe and Maisonneuve and whoever the other person that's on there? I can't remember. Noni Klassen. Yeah, Noni Klassen. Do you think that could play a role, or is that just more PR?
I don't know. I'm trying to really wrestle with this, because the more and more I hear these athletes talking about, it's calling up histories that men have lived, that they're trying to say, I'm not proud of this. I'm sorry if I hurt you. Tell me more about how I made you feel. Like, and this is not something, and maybe Scott and Taylor have more to add to this, but it's not something that I've come across within a public space, that this is actually being encouraged, and trying to work through this with particular venues or opportunities as such. I don't know. It's more of is that potentially a vehicle or a space to take this up?
And the parallel with TNR, I think, is really interesting, because I don't think we've progressed. We haven't decolonized. We're still operating exactly the same way in so many ways, right? And so we're not achieving reconciliation very effectively in that realm either. But maybe if we join forces and show that this is a social ill that we all need to embrace more fully, it might have more teeth.
I mean, I feel like the I feel like culture of hockey, anytime that you speak out or you go against the grain, and then we've talked about this already, right? That there is almost like an ostracizing or a punishment or a, you know, something has to happen, because you don't show. And the thing that came to mind when Tim was speaking is you go and play your buddy, you get in a fight with them, and I'm really good friends with Kyle Beach, and him and I got in a fight when we both played in the WHL, and we went and shook hands after, and blah blah blah. We all know what's happened with Kyle and in whatever context. And I've been verbally and psychologically abused too, like when I played junior hockey. But do I ever have a platform or space to talk about that? No. Does the Western Hockey League want to hear that? No. Because it's not a good reputation for them. I personally say now a lot of time to people who want to have their child go and play junior hockey. I said, it's really great if you want to pursue and play hockey, that you go and play in the States at an American university, because your child's older, they're more developed mentally, physically, emotionally, and they can handle themselves a lot better. And this comes back to like why I think it's important to protect kids. This ingrained culture happens to children, and nothing changes all the way up their trajectory. And we wonder why that they react and they respond in the way that they do. And adults just perpetuate that. So to me, it really comes back to protecting children and pulling on mechanisms. And this is why hockey, in my opinion, Hockey Canada has to get involved in the changing of creating space for people to share their story. This is why I love coming on areas like this and like talking about this. Do I wish I had 70 junior fights? No. Did I do it? Yeah. Do I believe that there should be a change now from it, like reflecting on everything that I've done? Yes. Am I going to try like hell my best to change that? You betcha. But not everyone has that same mentality. And because it's ingrained within the culture of hockey, and I think as a society, we need to take a step back and do a lot of reflecting on like the harms that we're perpetuating and putting people into through a sport that's supposed to be safe, fun, and all these other things, when really it's not.
And we're definitely reaching a tipping point in Canada. You know, it's just so rampant. I'm so proud of so many people for speaking out. But you're right, Scott. I've done it myself, been that, I don't love the word whistleblower, but you know, you call something out and then because you're naming it, you're blamed for it, which doesn't make any sense, right? And then ostracized or blacklisted or pushed out as the problem because you're naming the problem. Challenging.
Like, so the example that I like to give is so we've seen how effective removing body checking from non-elite ice hockey is, right? Those players will never play at a high level. We don't need to put them at risk as children. I still think that should be a level up. You know, so, but the one where I get a lot of pushback on, especially from all my buddies, all my friends who played hockey, like I have lots of friends and acquaintances who played in the Western Hockey League, who played pro, is on the fighting thing. And so I am very strongly now on the side of you cannot put people in harm's way, especially children. And so it's funny the responses that I always get when I like pose this question to them. And the main one that always comes across, well, you know, it's part of the game. It's built within the culture. And I say, yeah, but like as a, you know, I can speak to my experience. I didn't know the inherent risks when I was doing that, when I was 16 years old. And so if someone's not informed of the risks that they're taking and they're not getting paid millions of dollars, we shouldn't be doing that. And so I really do strongly believe that it is on the adults in the room, the executives, the people in charge to step up and take a stand and to start to change the game, start to change the culture, and then we'll start to see a trickle down effect. And that's not only like at the executive level, but like it's professionals as well. We don't see hockey players speak out like other sports do, right? And there's a reason for that. And so it's like across the board at the top, in my opinion. And so as much as we've seen change, I feel like we have such a long way to go in the sport of hockey.
And I see that phenomenon organizationally and individually, that sort of resistance to changing and growing and learning when you're being challenged, and instead protecting, right? There's this protectionism, a fear. I think it circles right back to what Tim's saying about identity. Because if we start saying, well, you're doing this wrong, well, then, you know, they're having to admit that they're wrong. And that can really take a big chunk out of their sense of identity and purpose and doing things well. Instead of, well, we're learning, we're all learning, and you're not wrong, you're just learning and figuring things out. What are we protecting? Not we, but what are people protecting in hockey, in protecting the violence and fighting and discrimination and misogyny?
I mean, right, just to quickly return to something that Scott brought up there, and to return to a phrase he used about rowing, where you're moving backwards quickly, which by the way is an amazing description of rowing. I do get that feeling sometimes when it comes to a lot of the issues you're just describing here. We are moving. I do believe that there is an accelerant aspect to this in terms of a negative pressure that has developed regarding it is now fashionable to resist these forces. So we talk about, like Scott was just bringing up here. First of all, I'll just say again, Scott, I cannot imagine what it would be like to have someone tell you basically like, it's a part of the game. It's like, you are like, yeah, I know, buddy. I was there. Like, of course I know that. Like, who's going to tell you that hey, did you know that fighting's a part of the game of hockey? It's like, yeah, no kidding. But like that notion of resistance where it's like, if you want to change things because you don't understand it, well, no one's going to be able to tell Scott he doesn't understand the game of hockey, right? Like, of course he does. He was there. So the problem with I see is in terms of pros speaking out is there is actually more accessibility, more avenues for reaching NHLers and ex-NHLers and alumni and work that frankly, Tim, I just think about some of the podcasts that exist right now and the ethics approvals that would have had to go into obtaining some of the disclosures that these guys are just giving. I mean, it would have taken 60 years of ethics approvals just to get one of these, 3-hour podcasts. But the problem is there's an industry now that's been created around, I mean, is disclosure the right word? Sometimes you have genuinely meaningful disclosures given by these players. Look, there is a very nasty world. Barstool is partially responsible for creating this. If you're not familiar, they're a multinational or multimedia corporation, now multi-million-dollar corporation at this point. But there's this podcast called Spit and Chicklets, and it's extremely well listened to. And there's one of them. For instance, I had students that will bring up this one episode as an example of, player disclosure. This player talks about being drunk when they got their first NHL call-up and hung over on their first NHL game. And none of my students really picked up on what this message really was, which is like, can you imagine working your whole life for something, doing something so long, enduring everything that we've described here to get to this point? And for your first day at work of your dream job that you've probably, taken years off your life and damaged your body forever, you're hungover? And this wasn't an accident. They did it intentionally. And I remember thinking to myself, like, so this method of disclosure is fantastically has the potential for positiveness that's out there right now because Spit and Chicklets has cloned or spawned, goodness, 30 or more nearly identical podcasts, and many of them are ex-players who played in a hyper-aggressive way. I'll say that. Like, to be perfectly honest, like, I mean, one of the figures there, Paul Bissonnette, is a talented media personality and a number of other things, but he was a harder player. He played a more aggressive role, but there are several of them now. And the problem is, when I see young people who are coming into contact with hockey media right now, there's an avalanche of perspectives now hitting them when they're 13, 14, when this stuff is really cool. And they're not critically examining, the issues of violence the way that, Tim, you're describing in your personal interviews with them, because they're not there to give you authentic view. They're there to give you the impression that a lot of this stuff is authentic, off the cuff stuff. But, in Spit and Chicklets sense, they're there to sell gin, sometimes they're selling you bed sheets. They're selling you male grooming kits. Like, it is still very much the mechanisms of capitalism at play in a lot of these podcasts that feel conversational in nature. And this is something that I think is really fueling the recalcitrance. Is now I can listen to an enforcer from the late 90s tell me war stories that just absolutely will blow your mind about, getting into a fight one night and, readjusting a broken finger, mid-fight and it sounds like listening to stories from the Second World War. It just seems like an absolutely fantastic journey. And then I've got to hear some jerk named Taylor McKee say that this stuff isn't cool. I mean, look, it sounds cool to me. And that's one of the differences. Like, say in 1995, you didn't have public platforms that were this well disseminated, this optimized for the algorithmic, experience of being young. You had to go get a Rock'em Sock'em VHS, which I had, and you had to go sort of seek it out in that way, right? Now, the things that are cool and are associated with hockey are inextricably linked to versions of the game that are kind of past. And if we needed a test case, we got it this year. Matt Rempe, if you're not familiar with who he is, he's a 6'7" player from Calgary. He's a fantastic hockey player, but he came into the NHL here and became a cult hero. He got into like 3 fights in his first 3 games. And by the end of it, even the most serious hockey enthusiasts or fighting enthusiasts were questioning whether or not this was safe for him. He was a young kid in hockey terms, and he was going up against seasoned grown men who fought their whole, professional careers. And he became just an icon because, again, it speaks to this notion of, see, you're all wrong. We don't need to change. We don't need any of this stuff. What we need is a good old-fashioned Matt Rempe type of player. And I think that was deeply concerning for me because there is this undercurrent in young hockey fans right now that wishes the game the way it was like in the 90s. And it's not changing the way in which I think I expected it to when I was 21. I thought that all of this was going to go away, with time, but that's certainly something that I've noticed is pushing against our attempts to resist, and in fact, maybe even accelerating things backwards.
Accelerating backwards.
That's so interesting that you say that, Taylor. Because so not to push back on it at all, because I completely agree. Having, when I think about when I first came into the Western Hockey League, like Milan Lucic was on the Giants, right? Like, we all know what like he was like, right? And I remember my first game as a 16-year-old. I was like, well, why isn't he playing? He fought Milan like literally the game before my first game, he broke his orbital bone. Like, he's not playing, right? Like, and so I personally feel like, having been exposed in that environment, and so I do feel like there is like a progression that we are seeing, especially I say more so at the professional level, a little bit of this, and this is why I love hockey. The skill, the tenacity, the cerebralness of the sport, of the game, the thinking around the game, right? I feel like we're like and maybe this is because it's too slow. Like this distance that we're traveling is too slow and it needs to be quicker. I don't know if that's the answer, but I do feel like if you ask me in 10 years, will there be fighting in hockey? If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said yes. If you ask me today, I say I don't know. And then if you ask me, hopefully in a year, I would say, well, and my true answer would be I don't think we need it personally. So I love watching the women's product personally. I have since I was a kid, like always watching the Olympics. It was one of my favorite things to watch because you knew the product was going to be real good. Everyone loved Canada, USA because there was a level of aggressive, assertive tenacity. You know, it was going to be tight checking. It was going to be a good product. It is what hockey should be. And so maybe that's what we need to hold up, is like this ideal of what hockey should be and strive towards that. It got me thinking when you were talking, if you go on Twitter, the Memorial Cup's on right now.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, saw the fight on TSN. Oh, there's a camera on the ice while they're fighting. This is so great. Like, there's a new, so hopefully we don't see now that, all of a sudden someone's going to run onto the ice with a camera in an NHL game just so they can broadcast a fight, right? So it feels like, as much as we take, to sum this all up, we take a few steps forward. It feels like all of a sudden, as late as last week, as this hockey season, we take a step back. But I do feel like we are very slowly, incrementally taking some steps forward in the violence of the game. It's just like we just need to keep pushing that notion forward of what hockey should be or could be if we remove, fighting, if we aren't putting people at risk. Because Matt Rimpey's a great example. It's unfortunate. I actually know his billet from Seattle quite well. And she's super supportive of him, but knowing that and this is like the personal side, what we all have to go through, like the experiences, the harm to our bodies, is just like at that level where if you have hockey people questioning in society, like why doesn't a regular person think that that's okay? Like why is it okay for a 21-year-old to have two black eyes, stitches, and like in regular society, if someone came like that into the hospital, we would have a social worker come and look at them because we think they were assaulted.
Exactly.
So why does it make it okay? Because it's in the context of a game.
And that's coming up a lot for us as in the academic world around the exemption of sport. That somehow it's different, but it isn't. It's human beings taking part in some kind of human endeavor. Hey, I love that, the idea we gotta keep pushing because there's a little step, but yeah, there's always that equal and opposite resistance. And hanging on. What are we hanging on to? What are people hanging on to? We haven't heard from you for a bit, Tim. I think this is what you examine, this identity piece. What are these people protecting? What are they so afraid to lose? In sorry, Tim, organizationally, I constantly hear Well, we're protecting the organization as a whole, Jen. And that's why we're not actually going to evolve or change or listen to any of the critiques that are coming our way, because we can't, allow this to tarnish the reputation of the organization. Tim.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, and trying to move, hockey gets talked about in a silo sometimes. So it's the game of hockey. So you see these very narrow understandings of masculinity within the game of hockey. I think, can we pull the camera back and get a more panoramic view of how does patriarchy embed itself in multiple institutions as well? I know we tend to look at hockey and that's our conversation, but how do we keep focusing on hockey in the small, but also connect it to society writ large in multiple institutions, in boardrooms, in schools, in other places where patriarchy and certain dominant forms of hegemony around masculinity are also thriving. And it's not to take, oh, it's not happening in hockey, but I keep thinking we need a macro view to the small, to the whole, to the part constantly. And I think, and again, getting back to Bell Hooks, and I think that's her, she's not the only one writing about this, obviously, but I think it's patriarchy also has, needs a critique. And I think they say that there's this phrase that Gadamer uses, he says, all play is being played. It's kind of, we play the game, but we're being played by it as well. So the things that we're asked to do aren't of our own accord all the time. We're following the rules, the structures, and the cultures in the game of hockey. I can't do whatever I want on the ice, but there's room for me to have some freedom. It's the same thing in society, that we're all being played by notions of patriarchy in certain particular ways. And so how do we hold those up for explicit critique or interrogate those things that also find themselves in the arena?
Who's winning in that game? Like, who is doing the playing then?
Well, I think, just to, don't have the answer to that question, but there's a dehumanizing element to this that we don't often talk about. And I think Taylor's point of, we can look at these horrific things as almost intrigue and being sought after. And I think Remke it's a really interesting phenomenon that it's brought back something of the warrior back into the game, into the highlight. And I think the broadcast on TSN with regards to the playoffs right now, Kelly Rudy opens up a segment on the warrior athlete again, scars on the face. It's just, it entrenches it even further. So I think with Scott, I think there are inroads. There are people finding this abhorrent behavior, but it's not, I don't think we're there yet.
And maybe that's the opportunity for education, is waking people up to the fact that we are being played by this, and the only ones benefiting are those making the millions off of these young men often, but people.
Yeah, I mean, being played too, I think, Jennifer, when you think of the fans and you watch a fight break out and the response to the fans, what's going on in one's psyche that you're watching someone potentially getting seriously injured, breaking bones, and worse, ending careers with concussions? What is going on? If someone was going to answer that, it'd be interesting to hear a fan say, this is why there's something about the Coliseum that is alive and well.
Yeah, and to speak to that, Tim, like one thing that I keep hearing as a counterweight to this argument of saying, if I was positioning the argument that says that, like, look, fighting has long outlived its purpose in hockey and needs to be eradicated, as this notion of, well, consumer behaviors say that the fans love it. You hear this over and over again. Oh, the fans love it. The fans love it. The fans love it. Watch a fight in the game. The fans are on their feet. They absolutely love the game when there's a fight in it. And it is a grim sort of commentary on our sort of slavish devotion to the capitalist forces that govern sport, which said, well, I guess if the consumers want it, that's why we have a damn slap fighting, competition that's going on right now. I mean, look, there were crowds at public executions. Okay, like, there is no limit to what people will not pay for when it comes to violence. There is no limit. It is incumbent upon the purveyors of sport to set reasonable limits on that violence. This notion that, like, well, hey, people love it, so we're not going to get rid of it. That is the least convincing argument I can possibly fathom for the game and say, hey, you want to grow the game? Well, Americans love fighting. It's like, well, great. Are we really going to try and make the rules of hockey reflect what our perceived tastes of the American consumer are? And that's why we're going to have junior A in Manitoba have a certain rule about fight. Does this make any sense to, and like that level of like, well, the consumer behaviors are going to, and this is something that, in my field in sport management, we use these as justification sometimes, but not critically analyze them. Say like, okay, great. Who cares what the consumers think here? Are they going to turn off the game itself? Are they going to turn their back on the game? You know what? Let's try it first and see if it happens first. And we'll see. That's where I keep going back to, versions of the game without fighting. NCAA hockey has no permitted fighting. It's full cages from a duty of care and medical insurance reason why we're there. And, women's game doesn't have fighting. And the NHL, the Stanley Cup playoffs has very, very, very little fighting and still huge number. So if we're going to even play the sort of capitalist argument, you can still make articulate arguments to say that you don't actually need it. But one of the things that's so, grimly frustrating is the fact that, what Scott, you're describing there, that like the players who have lived it, right, who understand the stakes, who understand the costs. I mean, it's somewhat reminiscent of having, people who've seen active duty combat setting military policy, where it's like, if you let the public set military policy, sometimes we look at the public, we don't actually know necessarily what goes into fighting and serving in the military. Sometimes it makes sense to let people sort of express that experience when it comes to setting policy, because the problem is, consumer tastes, I think, and this is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this accelerating factors. I don't think within the game there is an attitude in those junior hockey locker rooms that like, hey, I wish we had more, 6'6", completely immobile people who are just, out there to fight. I don't think that those locker rooms are saying, I wish we had less functionally skilled and fast players. They want to win games, and they know that the best way to win games is to be faster and more talented. So tactically, the game has sort of moved out of us fighting space. But this is this sort of tension between like the consumer tastes and how much that should govern, how the sport is actually administered. And again, Rempe is going to spawn a lot of copycats. I guarantee. I mean, we already seen there's been players who've been, essentially relegated to the American League who brought right back up just to fate smash Rempe. There's going to be new, young, very large players who are going to get moved up the system. I think you're going to see it as soon as this draft. You're going to see a couple kids in the 5th, 6th, 7th rounds who are just gigantic, seen as possibly the next Matt Rempe. Matt Rempe sold a ton of jerseys. Matt Rempe has signs. He is an extremely, pervasive influence in sort of the consumer taste side. So my concern when I see it in undergraduate students is the sort of consumer taste of the hockey fan is not evolving as quickly as I think is what Scott mentioned here, is actually the players themselves, who have evolved a lot about the role of violence and themselves. But if we allow consumer tastes to dictate the future of hockey, then what are we doing here? Then yeah, let's have fighting. We'll have a separate hockey fighting league. That'll draw big numbers, I guarantee it. So I mean, that's my big concern, is that like we shouldn't be asking the questions of like, well, what do the fans want? Well, again, they want whatever's entertaining, and some things that are entertaining are harmful. And I think that that's sort of where we have with fighting and hockey sometimes.
And that's the purpose of sport. Sport is education. Sport is supposed to be modeling and improving society, developing us. It's supposed to be holding up principles that we can all learn from. And yet you're right, we're kind of allowing it to succumb to populism and sullying it in the process. Really, that's why I'm so devoted to sport, trying to restore its power and purpose. What about the women? The women could maybe, we're talking about, well, what are the roles of these elite athletes? But maybe there's where a role for women. Although I see a lot of pressure on the women right now to fight. I've seen some fights in their games, and I worry about that's going to start to pervade their game as well. What do you think? We have 2 minutes left. Scott.
I mean, I do think because it's more on like a global stage now, or a North American stage, that there has been like, if you do watch the PWHL compared to say the Olympics, there is this level of aggressiveness and assertiveness in the game. To me, that just like that harbors, that comes back to the rule set. We use the rules. As long as penalties are called and enforced, I can't see it getting to the same level that it's entrenched in the male game. Like it is, come hell or high water, fighting is going to be in the NHL, I think, for years to come. But it's not the women's game, and I think it doesn't need to be. I think what you're seeing is almost like that competitiveness per se. I don't think as much what we're seeing is a reflect. At least I hope not. It doesn't seem like, women want to say, oh, I want to go and fight this person or do whatever. It's because they have this platform now, and they're being assertive and competitive as they can. And like, I'm so excited to watch the game tonight. Like, I can't wait. Like, I'm gonna go off here and make sure it's recorded, so I can watch that and the NHL game. But I think what we're seeing is, at least I hope, is not that like trickle down effect from the men's league that they need to do this to be competitive to watch, because I think that the product they're producing is just as competitive and entertaining, especially if you watch game 4. Like, how exciting was that overtime? Right? Like, so it's just as exciting as the NHL playoffs. So I hope that it's not. But I think when we come back to like rules and policies and all these things that govern the women's sport and game, that there isn't the same chance for the aggressiveness, the potential for the harm to occur in the same manner.
Nor the pressure on women to be so hypermasculine, although there's a bit of that because you're in a man's world of sport, but that's changing. Tim and I had a big chat, and just to wrap up, a while ago, about how can we make it cool to not be violent. And I think in a way the women are cool, increasingly cool, and so there is this wonderful wave of opportunity to be leaders in the space, which would be great to see. Oh my God, that was just amazing discussion. Thank you so much for the brilliant insights, all the different, I think we often feel like we haven't generated solutions, but I think you've generated 50 different solutions, different areas where all our people that were participating and are going to listen to this recording can exert some pressure on the leaders in terms of policy, in terms of your own local space where you can have some influence. Supporting the women's game, supporting the international game, these environments where we're not seeing the same sort of norms play out, understanding that we're going to have to keep pressing because there is that counter impact all the time, and always being critical thinkers and calling things out. Thank you so much. I think you've inspired. We had lots of people show up today, so that was great. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to Ariana for her support always. And again, thank you to these wonderful guests. We'll be in touch. If you want to stay on for a minute, we can just chat and kind of debrief. I'd like to do that just for a minute or two. And we'll say goodbye to all our participants. And Ariana, I'm sure you have lots to do, unless you want to hang out. We have one more thing to post. There we go. Wrap up the recording. Thank you. Take care. We'll see you next time. We'll be in touch with the next webinar episode.